Hey, this is Jeff. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and join us at the table as we talk to another great leader about faith, church, and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Drip. So welcome to the table, Shawn.
Hey, great to be with you guys. It's an honor. Your reputation precedes you. Billions of downloads. And
I don't know what show you're on.
Amen. And in Jesus' name.
Oh, is that not the show?
Prophetic. That's prophetic. Thank you for being prophetic.
Hey, Shawn, so great to have you on the show, man. Listen, your bio to get here is not necessarily the typical route that someone would take, but I mean, you've been a real estate developer, you've been a mega church pastor and a church planner, and now you're a coach. So how did you move from this arena of making big deals and closing on real estate to having conversations about Jesus and leadership and life? So kind of give us a little bit of your story.
Well, I never wanted to be a pastor. That's for sure. No one in my family's ever been a pastor. It's not in my lineage. A lot of them have been in prison, but none of them, been pastors. But I was teaching a college and career Sunday school class. Do you remember those?
Oh, yeah.
And God brought revival to the class, to my church. We just got swept up in an amazing move of God. And I was the top selling real estate agent in the county. My family's been in the real estate business for 50 years. And I walked in 2 weeks after I won the award to tell my dad I felt like God was calling me into the ministry. And he compared me to David Koresh that day. He said even David Koresh thought he was doing God's will. That was a fun conversation. Really well. Yeah. So I made a huge financial sacrifice, took about a 90% pay cut, and went off to seminary, moved to Atlanta to start a church in 1999, and kind of the rest is history, but I always felt like an executive trapped in a pastor's body. Mm-hmm. The church grew and we were a mega church within 2.5 years.
Wow.
But I felt like it was in spite of my preaching, not because of it. I kind of endured preaching to be able to do the between the Sunday leadership stuff.
Right.
And quickly began to realize most church planters were not wired, that way. So we began coaching church planters first and foremost, back in 2001, so this month marks about 20 years. I've been coaching pastors. And so I knew I would do it full time one day.
Yeah.
And then made the leap about 6 years ago to do just that.
Yeah. So you make an interesting point. I love the preaching side of it. I'm probably a terrible executive. I know I'm a terrible executive. Let's just be clear about it. Like that part of my leadership is not great. The preaching, the teaching, the vision casting is really sort of the sweet spot of what I do. So how are you helping leaders who have that tension, or are you bringing somebody alongside them who has that skill set?
Yeah, it's both. And, our will set, if you will, is one-on-one coaching. So we tried to pair a pastor with a coach that complements their strengths. Nothing wrong with being great at preaching. The only point at which I disagree with John Maxwell, and if you really drill down with him on it, you won't misunderstand him. He says, just focus on your strengths. But I've actually never had a pastor or a church say to me, what took us down was our strengths.
Yeah.
It's your weakness. It's your blind spot. It's your Achilles heel. So we try to put them with a coach that's not just like them, that can help them get better in their blind spots, in their weak areas, and the things that could be holding back their ministry, to help them bring that up to speed with where they are naturally strong.
Yeah, we just had a conversation with Arden Brevier recently, and one of the things that we talked about on that show was just turning young people loose. So in this season of local church ministry that we're experiencing, where so much is digital, this is probably one of the greatest platforms in history for young people to kind of come in and cover the blind spots of senior leaders who are not unintelligent, not incapable. It's just not natural, right? Because this is a native digital generation that we have at our fingertips. And I think sort of that approach is a powerful approach. And I think you make a great point about helping leaders cover their weaknesses, either through hiring or through training or through volunteer empowerment, whatever the case is. But so this idea of coaching and the traits that you have, I mean, the momentum piece of it is such a huge conversation, right? How do you get momentum? How do you keep momentum? And there are books by Maxwell, many others who write about the big mo, if you want to call it that. So in your experience through coaching, what seems to be the difference maker between those who are getting it done and those who are struggling to get it done?
Yeah, to me, that boils down to one word in my mind. It's just consistency.
Gotcha.
The most successful churches I know are ruthlessly consistent. They have a plan. They work their plan. They have a spiritual process, a spiritual pathway. They have a teaching calendar that's taking people on a journey, not just, hey, here's a cool verse out of my quiet time. Let's do a series on it. It's connected to their strategic direction. They're disciplined. They're focused. They're not distracted, by the news and what's going on in the world. They just have their eyes on the prize, and they have a lot of discipline around that consistency. The leaders that I see getting stuck are just all over the place, squirrel,
Yeah.
and they're just constantly distracted, undisciplined, unfocused. So one of the things we try to do with pastors, hey, we need to look at your calendar, your
Right.
personal calendar.
Right.
Like, you guys have got to get more consistent. You got to get better at what you do.
Yeah. And you and I have mutual friends at Saddleback Church, and where I was on staff, and you've been there before. So, Rick, the culture, their dedication and their commitment to their systems. Right. And that is true. And I can state that emphatically. You're talking about leadership and pastors who are struggling to find it, being ruthlessly consistent. And I think you're right about how they're struggling through the distractions, but how much of that do you think is desperation to be like other churches who do have it ruthlessly consistent? And how do you handle the desperation piece, not just the distraction piece?
Yeah. So I think pastors are tempted to always look at the silver bullet, look for the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. My friend Larry Osborne, who was also out the West Coast, said, be cautious of the new thing.
Right.
But there's this tendency when a church breaks through, for everybody go out and grab their thing. Of course, I attend Church of the Highlands now here in Birmingham, and we got thousands coming down here. And I love my church, but not every church should try to be just like our church, because that came out of my pastor's testimony.
Right.
So the guys that I see crushing it they learn from other churches, but they don't try to become a copycat church.
Right.
They don't have vision schizophrenia and discipleship schizophrenia and worship schizophrenia. Like, they're learning from other churches, but they know who they are, and they stay in their lane, and they get better at what they do while learning from other churches versus, just new small group strategy every 18 months. You know what I'm saying? Which just wears people out, and you actually lose credibility, over time with your leaders.
So, Shawn, tell us, and as leaders, how do we go to a place like Church of the Highlands, which does a lot of things for ARC and other church planting organizations? How do we go and find the principles and not just the methods? Because I think what we do is we go see the method and we try to duplicate the method and miss the principle. So how do we go to a setting like that, or read a book or anywhere, and go, okay, I need to extract the principle for our church and implement it, not just the methodology?
Well, first, I think it comes out of an insecurity of who we are sometimes, so I need to get more familiar with my story. Jacob had a broken story, wrestled with God, walked with a limp, but like, God used that story powerfully, and every leader leads with a limp to some degree,
right?
Has wrestled with God to kind of be called into something, and I was just always secure enough in my own skin to be who God called me to be, and then when you go off and you take your team into a shared experience, like a visit to another church or a conference, I think it's important to debrief them in advance and say, hey guys, we are not trying to be another plug in the blank church,
right?
But we don't want to be critical today and point out everything we don't like about their church. That's Pharisaical. What we want to do is kind of sit in the middle and honor them, for what God's doing through them, and not be critical of them, and say, what can I learn from them? Man, in pastors' world, we're so critical of everybody who doesn't think just like us and do it just like us. But as a pastor, man, I just always had a humble posture. And with our team, like we can learn something from any church, anytime, as long as we don't realize we're not trying to copy them or be just like them.
Yeah, that's good. That's a point.
So this whole church reality that we're huge fans of. Jeff and I both obviously pastoral experience, and even though we're on a college campus now, but still, this is our heart. This is what we do. And I think in pastoral ministry, as you have learned, as I have learned, as Jeff has learned,
A lot of learning.
nobody does this alone, right? And probably one of the great mysteries of successful leadership, successful pastors, is the ability to build a team around them that helps them push the vision, carry the DNA, move forward, be in alignment, even if they're not in agreement, all of these things that are realities of great teams. And so what do you see now kind of in our current culture and condition? What are some of those great challenges to building great teams that we're facing? And maybe give us some pointers on how we can start overcoming that.
Yeah, well, the best book I read of 2019 was a corporate book called It's Always the Manager. It's always the manager. So I've got to grow as a leader. I've got to have a personal growth plan. I need a coach, because if I'm going to try to surround myself with people smarter than me, they're going to leave me. They're going to sniff me out if I don't have a plan to like get better, all of that. And then secondly, all your great, to quote the great theologian, Nick Saban, it takes
come at some point on the show, but
it takes both great recruiting and development, and great X's and O's, to win. So you got to recruit great talent, and you got to develop them. You got to invest into them, over time, and you've got to objectively assess them. One of the mistakes I see a lot of pastors make, it's kind of the Steve Jobs syndrome, where you got one genius and a bunch of idiots, just a bunch of yes men and yes women. And man, you've got to recruit people who can think critically for themselves and think strategically. There's products and projects, on a church staff. And you need a lot of projects, a lot of green people, a lot of inexperienced people, a lot of young people, but you bet they'll never become products unless you've got a product developing them into that and discipling them and mentoring them and coaching them. So we need 3 to 5 studs around us that are helping us recruit and develop, great talent and giftedness on our team.
I think something so critical about that point, though, is when we say 3 to 5 stallions or studs, we often think those have to be hires. In my experience as a pastor, especially in a system like I was at Saddleback, we were always very encouraged to find the studs and the stallions that are sitting in the audience, the attorneys who have perspectives that we don't, the highly successful multimillionaires and billionaires who view things differently than what we do. So your studs and your stallions may not necessarily be hires.
100%. In fact, there should be a balance. Exactly. I'm a big fan of having some guys with marketplace experience in our think tank.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think we need to overcome that fear of recruiting the people who are sitting in front of us to be at the highest levels of leadership in our churches, in our congregations, and in our.
It's a typical Moses argument, Rob. I hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, we don't really have the money, when we're in a blue collar town. I'm like, well, go out and find how many people are in your city, how many people are in your state, how many people have you pastored in your past that live in another state? Yeah. Go get them, ask them to move, sell their home, ask them to be a missionary with you, and come and change the world.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's always, I was in youth ministry for a while, and I have a heart for those going into youth ministry. And it feels like the comment is need a youth pastor, no pay, will pay as we grow. Like they're recruiting them like with this negative sort of like, we're not going to give you anything now, but if you grow this thing, I'm going to give you some money.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the best recruiting method, Shawn. How do we take even in small churches and recruit people, great people, into our church to help it grow?
Well, a great test is first, starting with somebody who's in the marketplace and, ask them for 8 or 10 hours a week and see how it goes. Just a vetting out process, for a filter. We, in the marketplace, they say hire slow and fire fast. In the church, we do right the opposite. We hire fast and fire too slow. And we've got to kind of reverse that trend, be a little bit more selective, in our selection process. And then, man, recognizing it's not a fit a little bit faster so we can get somebody in the right seat at the right time.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I'm all for that model of hire slow, fire fast. I think it weighs out in terms of building team chemistry, building team competency, getting yourself in the right position to have the most success in whatever it is you're doing. So I'm a huge fan of that. So part of that process then is actually moving people into the right seats.
John Gordon.
Right. So when you evaluate and you study your leadership structure or your team, you may realize that you have someone on your team who's a great fit for the organization, but not necessarily a great fit in that role. And so one of the hard conversations we often have to have is, hey, I love you. I think you're supposed to be here, but I think you need to be doing X, Y, and Z. So how do you do that in such a way as I'm not sure that you can always get away from upsetting or offending, but how do you do that in such a way that you keep the relationship intact?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, it's the number one responsibility of a leader is to be the culture architect.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to design the culture that we want to build, and culture happens by design or by default. So every day we've got to get up and build that culture. So we're trying to create a culture of change and instead of entitlement. The word title is in the middle of entitlement.
Yeah.
Where we're not defined by our titles and the goal is more important than the role. So just normalizing language on the front end, Andy Stanley was kind of one of my coaches there for a season. And he said, Shawn, when I hire somebody, I go ahead and tell them on the front end, hey, you will not be doing what you're doing 2 years from now. I just go ahead and set that expectation.
Right.
Either you're going to grow and develop and hire people to do what you're doing, or if you don't grow, somebody will be leading you and doing that job. So you get to choose.
Yeah.
And it just wow,
Yeah.
whoa, the clock is ticking, but it set expectation for me that I'm going to be moved around,
Right.
I'm going to be changed. The other thing I would say is that this is a drum I beat. This is a little bit controversial, but hear me out. Okay. I'm not a huge fan of spiritual gift inventory tests.
Okay.
Somehow the book of Acts got by without those, and it worked for them. How did they identify people's spiritual gifts? They didn't go off by themselves and assess their own giftedness in a notebook. Okay. Have you guys seen the early episodes of American Idol? We are not great assessors of our own giftedness.
That's right.
Yes.
On an island. You
Lots
know what
of
I'm saying?
Liars.
Yeah. We don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And we get this at the top level. Like when a young man feels called to ministry, there's an ordination process, a licensing process where that church says, yeah, you tell us you've heard from God and you got the gift of pastoring, but we're going to help you cement that or ratify that or tell you, you're not ready, And I think in every layer of ministry, there's a need to say, hey, I want to hear from you what you think you're gifted at. But as your spiritual leader, I want you to know we speak into that and help ratify that. You don't have the gift of teaching as much as you think you do yet. I'm just saying, for example.
Yeah, no, that's good. And so then what's the responsibility of the leadership then? How is a better question to foster that conversation, like with a young person coming into leadership, like, because I was 21 and thought a lot of myself. Like, I'm not gonna say I didn't. Like, so how do we navigate that to help them process through that into where they're going next?
Yeah. So just, I think setting the culture of expectation. My friend Matt Keller, you guys have probably had him on here.
Matt.
Yeah. So I coached them years ago. He went on to write a book on this later called The Key to Everything. What the key to everything is coachability. Yeah. So just having that conversation at the very outset. Hey, just so you know, we're a coaching culture. If you're defensive, average players don't like to be coached. Leave me alone. So let me go out there and do it the way I want to do it. Elite players run back over to the sideline and say, hey, coach, what can I do better? And having that conversation, one, you'll spit some people out. They say, well, that's not me. I want to be left alone. You hear student pastors say, why don't they just leave me alone? Let me do my job. Well, that's not the kind of culture we have here. Iron sharpens iron, one friend sharpens another. So here you're going to get heat and friction applied to your life because we're your friend and we care about you.
Right.
Wounds from a friend can be trusted. An enemy multiplies kisses. We don't multiply kisses on our team. Like we wound each other to make each other better because we care about each other. That's how we roll. And I've got to set the tone and receive that. I can't be a defensive senior leader, and I've got to help sort of model that, but then also just really hold everybody accountable to that. And if they get their hackles up, they get defensive, challenge them on that. Because if you get defensive when somebody's trying to speak into your life, you've just forfeited your best opportunity to get better.
Yeah. Deep in the quarantine season of this past of 2020, I binge watched The Last Dance. Did you watch that?
Yes.
And what's interesting about the conversation about the best players is Phil Jackson had to step in and eventually convince Michael Jordan to change entire offensive systems. Because Michael was the man before Phil Jackson got there.
Yeah.
And so he comes in and gets this non-selfish system, right? And we know the history from there. They go on to win 6 titles. What's interesting about it is suddenly Michael Jordan becomes the biggest cheerleader of the offensive system. The guy who didn't want it and was pushing against it early, when he sees that it works, becomes the biggest cheerleader.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you're saying, Shawn, is that when we can win over those who have been maybe opposed to this coachability idea, I think it really pushes everything forward.
Yeah, I have pastors, call me all the time, or we're in a coaching relationship with, and they're like, man, every time I try to talk to this guy, it gets defensive, with the team. We're walking on eggshells around him. And my first question is always, have you told him that? Have you told her that? 99 out of 100 times they'll say, well, no, which is why a lot of churches stop growing. Here's the reason why most churches stop growing. They choose to. They choose not to have the conversations that are critical for breakthrough.
Right.
And go to that pastor, go to that director, go to that deacon or elder and say, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this. Okay. But every time we try to press in a little bit on you, like, man, you are instantly defensive and it makes people not want to approach you, and I'm telling you, I've had that conversation dozens of times. I've got pastors who've said I've helped God use me to save their marriages, because it's not just showing up on their staff. It's showing up in their marriages. It's showing up in their ministry downstream, all of that, if they're a defensive, insecure leader.
Yeah. In the leadership courses I teach here at Lee, I never leave that course without talking about you can never lead at the highest level if you can't have the hard conversations. And this is not about our biblical values or our theological position or being Jesus to other people. Jesus clearly challenged his teams. He challenged people who are outside of his teams, obviously, Pharisees or whoever, right? So I think we have to get over this fear or this mental sort of hurdle that we have, that we can't have difficult conversations and still love. In fact, the difficult conversations are love, right?
I tell leaders, Jesus was full of grace and truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So some of us are I'm more naturally a truther. So before I have a conversation with somebody, I need to kind of run it by a gracer. And my wife's going to say, honey, whatever you do, don't say it like that.
Yeah. I'm a gracer. The Lord loves you.
And the gracers need to stretch the honest muscle. And there are a lot of pastors, just because the lineage and heritage and some misunderstandings of who Jesus is, frankly, where we've valued nice over honesty.
Yeah.
And we'll go home and say something to our spouse about a pastor that we're not willing to say to that pastor. Yeah. And a commitment I made to my team, nearly 20 years ago now, we've coached this to thousands of leaders, is that I will never, I've promised all my team for 20 years, I will never go home and say something to my spouse about you I'm not willing to say to you.
Yeah.
And guess what I expect from you? Which means we may have more robust dialogue, Patrick Lencioni calls it, intense fellowship, I call it, but we're going to understand each other better. And there's an integrity that comes with that and a respect, because we've got each other's backs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if Lencioni, Cotter, Shine, whoever you look at, I mean, they're all saying the same thing from an organizational perspective. In order for you to have a healthy organization, you have to be able to have these challenging conversations, right? It is the impediment, I think, a lot of times to growth. It's the impediment a lot of times to what we define as success, whatever that may mean. And we're going to talk about that in just a second with your most recent book. But the ability to have these hard conversations, especially right now in a cultural context where everything is being readjusted and reassessed. It's the perfect time to have these conversations because it makes sense. Don't just go back from the pandemic the way you were, because you have the opportunity here to stretch yourself well beyond what you ever could have imagined if you're willing to have these difficult conversations.
So, Rob, are you a grace or truth guy?
I'm a kind of a hybrid. Like,
really,
I don't know. That's sort of a cop out for me, but I can be extremely blunt, right?
Yes, that's true.
Or
that's true.
I can peddle the conversation way too long. I don't know. I don't know if that's
as a guy that's often aired on grace, which is my side. What I've had to learn is that truth is not a bad thing.
Right.
Like delivering truth and having hard conversations usually leads to better relationships. Like you talk about trust and those things. So as leaders, you're clearly going to fall on one side or the other. Most of us are not in the middle. As a grace guy, you've got to take that what feels like a major risk, like feels like I'm going to crush somebody.
Yep.
We have to have the hard conversation. And usually at the end of the hard conversation comes a better outcome.
Right.
Now, not always, but usually a better outcome.
Yeah.
It's very true. Very true.
Well, let's jump into your most recent book, Measuring Success. And let's talk about this for a moment, because I think success is one of those cuss words in local church ministry, because it's something we all desire. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having I think there's a godly sort of ambition that's healthy, right? Nothing wrong with success. How you measure success is different. How you determine and define success is yet even more different. So kind of walk us through your book, Measuring Success, and kind of what you see as a moving target for many leaders who are trying to find it.
Yeah. Well, there's several debates that go on. One is the debate between faithfulness and fruitfulness. And I get lit up sometimes on social media about what I post on leadership and organizational health and all of that. Like, we just need to preach the gospel. We just need to be faithful to the gospel. And, but there are a lot of churches being buried that are preaching theologically correct messages.
Mm-hmm.
Faithfulness is not enough. It's faithfulness and fruitfulness. Jesus expects us to bear fruit. Yes. And they're fruits of the Spirit. They're fruits of conversions. And if a church is not growing, it is quietly dying.
Yeah.
And so there's got to be a compulsion and an unction to see the needle move. Like, we've got to hold ourselves accountable for producing fruit, seeing lost people saved. If we're not, what are we doing? Right. Yeah. So it's not Great Commission or Great Commandment.
It's both.
It's both. I'm for the Great Commission, but not at the expense of the Great Commandment. Where these pastors are falling right and left, is where you emphasize one or the other out of balance. If you pursue church growth at the expense of church health, you get out of center, you get out of rhythm yourself. So I say, in defining success in my book, Measuring Success, the success is being loved and respected by those closest to us. It's my wife, it's my family, it's my team, it's my leaders, it's my church first. I ran a coaching organization for 16 years side by side, along with being senior pastor of the church, but it never really affected our church growth. My first priority was always Jerusalem. Yeah. My first priority, was always my family.
Right.
My first priority was always my team. Not being liked on Facebook or Instagram, nothing wrong with all that. That comes second, third, fourth down the line. So it's just a discipline to make sure we keep our eyes on the prize and not let the pendulum swing so far in our mind one way or another.
Yeah. So unpack that for us, this idea of being loved and respected, because there's a lot of definitions around that. So as you see it, and that being the mark of success, how do you define those two words then?
Yeah. Well, one, I tell pastors all the time, every pastor is an interim pastor. Mm-hmm. You're all going to leave your church. So what is your identity? You know, people ask me, how were you able to hand off the church and just kind of seamlessly go into coaching? I think it helped me to have a prior marketplace experience before becoming pastor. So my identity was never Shawn pastor. It was Shawn who happens to be a pastor for this season in his life, you know, and now can hand, because my identity was never pastor. So being secure in your own skin, you know, is really important there. But then it is being disciplined to spend more time with those closest to you. You do a study in the Gospels of all the times Jesus is trying to get away from people, actually stiff arming the crowds
Yeah.
to be with the few,
Yeah.
you know, and I think leaders need to do that more. And I got to hand off my church, not when I was 75, but when I was 45.
Right.
Yeah.
And here's what becomes even more an acknowledgement on your part, that if you finish well at all, you'll really finish with one team, your family.
That's valuable.
And the people that you've developed and invested into. And I've got ex-staff members that hate me like every pastor, you know, but most of my best friends are pastors who worked for me formerly.
Yeah.
You know, and if that sounds like I'm boasting about that, I'm boasting about that. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
Because somehow I ordered my life and lived in such a way that they feel like they can be my friend when I'm not their boss.
And
You
I think
know,
that's not the common story. I think a lot of times when staff leave, there's almost a detachment. Like I'm detaching from all those people and that culture and that environment. And then we put all kinds of negative labels on it. It was toxic. It was whatever. But I think it's valuable to be able to leave a place and go, those are still my people. And those are still my family or my my mentors, my friends. Because I don't think that's very common in the church right now.
hey, yeah, and I tell leaders all the time, I mean, if you want to surround yourself with people smarter than you, they won't. I need to do that. I'm from Alabama. Okay. We're 48th on every list. Thank God for Mississippi and Louisiana. Okay. So I've always needed to surround myself with people smarter than me. So that means people are not going to follow me because I'm smarter than them.
Yeah.
So how do you get people smarter than you to follow you? You have to be healthier than they are.
Mm.
And you have to care about them more than they care about you. That's the gospel, isn't it? I mean, that's the gospel. And if you do that, then really, really brilliant people will leave large ministries to come work for you because you care about them, because you're not a transactional leader.
Right.
And you're not just using them to get ministry done. It gives you a literal competitive advantage in the hiring marketplace of ministry. And it is competitive out there to find great people. You know, that you're going to be a leader that spends time with your team, develops them, invests them, cares about them as human beings, not human doings. Man, you look back a few years later and you got all these amazing leaders wanting to come be a part of what you're doing.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. I'm probably going to tweet out that one statement at some point today because
you'll be tagged on Twitter.
Yeah. So you're obviously in the consulting world. You've done a ton of it over 20 years, obviously been quote unquote successful in many capacities. And one of the real trendy things to learn and talk about, at least here in the States, again, we're obviously in American context, but is this church growth strategy, church growth movement, church growth ideas, programs, which I'm a fan of. I think that books, conferences, like I think there's a lot of amazing content out there that aids and supports local church leadership and church growth. I think from a local church perspective, one of the things, and we've kind of talked about this already, that's difficult is going to a conference and walking away more frustrated than what you came with, right? So because you can't actually do some of the things that you see or you hear, or it's not scalable or whatever. So church growth as a topic has been kind of trending the last decade or so, especially. And so what are your perspectives on the church growth movement? I mean, where is it at right now? Where do you see it going? Give us some inside kind of intel on that.
So it's the only point at which I've disagreed with you today, Rob.
Okay.
Because the church growth movement is not 2 decades old. It's 2 millennia old.
True. That's true.
Yeah.
I stand corrected.
Okay.
Acts chapter 2:47, the church grows daily. Acts 4:4, the church grows to 5,000 men. Acts chapter 5, verse 14, multitudes are added to the church regularly. Acts chapter 6, the disciples select leaders over care ministry so they can focus on the Great Commission. On and on and on and on. So I think, man, there needs to be a course correction out there in terms of what we call the church growth movement.
Right.
I think we began to kind of recover, and swing the pendulum 2 decades ago, where the focus had kind of been back on the faithfulness side instead of the fruitfulness side.
Right.
We're like, hey, but we're not baptizing people, through water baptism. We're not seeing people get saved, and we got to value lost people more, and we've got to change how we're doing things to position ourselves to connect with unbelievers in our worship services. All that's been a really, really good thing. We just got to be careful. Once again, we don't run way out here, on the Great Commission end of things and pursue growth at the expense of health. We talk about the 3 gears of growth at Courage to Lead: culture, team, and systems. So we talk about positioning and preparing our ministry for growth. You don't presume on growth. You get prepared for growth.
Right.
And you grow in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. So it's like the widow in 2 Kings and the jars of oil. When did the miracle stop? When the number of prepared jars ran out. Right. I tell pastors, like, if your team is overwhelmed with anxiety now, why would Jesus send 100 new people? It'd crush you. One thing we know, he's not going to send us more people than we can handle. Yeah. I don't know how large Jesus wants to grow our church, but I know he's not going to grow it more than we can handle. Mm-hmm. So what we need to posture ourselves to do is get positioned and prepared to be a church that can handle more. And I think a lot of pastors are praying, Jesus, grow our church, grow our church, grow our church. And Jesus saying, get better, get better, get better, get better. And then I can trust you with more. Then I can send some new people your way, and you'll be good stewards of them. And it won't crush you. It won't crush your team. It won't crush your leadership. It won't cause you to lose your marriage, because you're overextended and you're not able to handle it. So that's really the value of coaching, is working on us and working on our team and working on our culture and working on our structure, working on our systems, working on our process. And then one day you have these overnight successes where Jesus goes, now they're ready.
Right.
Now they're ready, and revival breaks out.
Yeah.
So to your point, which I think is obviously true, I feel like we're shifting from this church growth movement, which was kind of the emphasis of the question, into a church health movement, which I think is I don't want to say just a better, but it's a more biblically aligned sort of approach, Christ-centered approach to being healthy leaders, healthy local churches, more than, quote, successful or growing. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Anybody can draw a crowd, right? I mean, you can be a great speaker, very charismatic, you can build a crowd, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're healthy.
Very true.
I think moving from that numbers based, again, God counted numbers, so that's important, but moving from that being the emphasis to church health becoming, or leadership health, or volunteer health, or organizational health becoming sort of the emphasis. I think that's the trending direction that I see, that I think I'm a big fan of.
I agree. I'm with you, my friend.
So in this sort of position and prepared to handle more, you talked about that, and that we have greater capacity. Use the 2 Kings passage, more jars. What's the first step for a leader, for a pastor, to bring in more jars, to be ready for more?
Yeah, so we tell pastors it's okay to set scoreboard-oriented goals. That's actually a good start. Hey, what would we love to believe God for? What does that look like? But then break it down into process-oriented goals. So if we want to say, hey, let's just get positioned and prepare where we could handle 100 more people. Well, we need 10 new small group leaders. We got to break it down that far. We need to recruit 10 new small group leaders, have them trained, deployed, prepared, ready, for a potential growth season this fall. And how many children, that's going to be 30% of those are going to be children. So how many children's leaders, new children's leaders are we going to need? That's going to be about 50 more cars on our campus. Do we have a plan?
Yeah. Right.
So it's getting our infrastructure, getting those empty jars prepared. So when the oil starts flowing, We don't go, oh no, I wish we'd have had more jars.
Yeah.
We want to be, we don't know what God's going to do, but let's get positioned and prepared for whatever God wants to do.
Yeah. It seems like a delineation between leading and chasing. Like, so if I'm leading, I'm out in front, getting prepared. If I'm chasing, it feels like I'm just running crazy, trying to gather
True.
after the fact.
Yeah.
True. Craig Groeschel talks about initiating, not reacting.
Mm-hmm.
And too many pastors like react all the time instead of, hey, let's get off campus. Let's plan this out. Let's drill it down into the details of what we really need to do to get postured and prepared to do more.
And I think part of the sad reality is a lot of our pastors don't even know how to take that step.
It's true.
They don't know how to plan.
Yeah.
They don't know how to prepare. They don't know what
Yeah.
a strategic plan is. They don't know how to do assessments and organizational assessments. And, that's part of the discussions that we've had on the show, even here being on a Christian college campus, academically driven, our pastoral ministries program, which we both graduated from, which we both love, which we both are huge fans of. But are we churning out leaders in the pastoral roles that are able to do a strategic plan? Are they able to do, those kind of, so that's a huge challenge in and of itself, is helping our leaders understand what that means and how to even take that first step.
And then it's like making a budget. You get out there, you create a budget. Most people don't live on a budget because you hit a wall, the refrigerator breaks down, you throw the whole plan out. Harvard Business Review says 91% of strategic plans fail. So it's one of the values of coaching, to hold a leader's hand and hold them accountable to not giving up on the plan.
Right.
Creating the plan is about 10% of the work. Then we've got to go out and kind of hold ourselves accountable. And if we hit some walls, we hit some resistance, to tweak but not retreat and keep pressing and following through. That's where that consistency comes full circle.
Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot is a system can be just as anointed and holy as a spontaneous move of God. And I think we've got to sort of be able to elevate both conversations better, right? There's a lack of balance, I think, especially coming from this Pentecostal sort of movement that we're a part of. We love the spontaneity of the Spirit, the move of the Spirit, which we appreciate deeply and we love deeply. But there's also a holiness to order. There's a holiness to systems.
It's both. Once again, it's both, right? It's not spontaneity or order.
Exactly.
It's both. And if I'm more spontaneous in nature, I probably need to work on a little bit of the order. If I'm more ordered in nature and I'm a control freak, that's me, I need to work a little bit more and giving the Holy Spirit some room,
right,
in my life and in our services and in our meetings and, all of that. So it's both.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. Obviously, Shawn, we're in a season where church has shifted dramatically. Gathering is hard. Getting together is difficult. Online church, everybody went online last March in some form or fashion. How are you helping pastors sort of measure engagement at this point?
Well, first, I just want to champion pastors that are watching, listening, today. Church just had the most innovative year it's had maybe in 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we didn't think we were up to the task. We had many private freak out moments, but the lion's share of churches we've worked with, though it hasn't been perfect, no leader knew what to do unless they were leading in 1918 during the last pandemic.
Yeah.
Right.
But the church innovated with amazing, ease compared even to a lot of marketplace organizations.
Right.
Like, man, we made huge sweeping changes quickly re-engage people. So I just want to say, pastor, don't get down on yourself because you look online and see somebody doing it better than you today. A lot of you are better. You're a lot better. You're a lot positioned to connect with unbelievers in the digital space than you were a year ago. We just got to continue down that path. Probably one of the areas I see that's a need for pastors to recognize, we've gone online with our services. Okay. So we're allowing everybody to engage on Sunday. We've really got to take that worship service experience on Sunday, an hour and a half in nature, and realize not everybody has that attention span. Not everybody's going to tune in that medium and say, okay, how do we kind of slice that up and create 7-day-a-week engagement.
That's an interesting thought.
And for example, you can slice up that sermon into 3-minute versions and, drip that out on social media and into your email list, and maybe then move them to take, the next step, by what you're saying. And it's not about quantity, it's about quality. For too long, churches said, hey, come to this, attend this. We want you to show up at this. Well, we can't do that right now.
Right.
So really what we need to do is add value. And that's going to drive up engagement over time. As we do that, it's going to really cause people to want to come and be more involved and take the next step.
Yeah.
Man, Shawn, I really hate to kind of wrap up the show here, but we are getting close to time, and we certainly want to respect yours. First of all, it's just been a joy, because Jeff and we love these kinds of conversations. We want to have them often, but I do hope we get to see you on campus at some point here at Lee University, and I do hope we get to stay connected to you. But we do like to ask every guest on the show a final question, and that final question is, what is one lesson you learned in college that did not take place in the classroom?
Well, somehow God planted the seed in me that I was not smart enough on my own to do this, and not wise enough on my own. And best decisions I made early on was to reach out and find me some coaches in my life. I've had great coaches. I mean, it's a who's who list, from Rick Warren to Larry Osborne, to Dan Ryland, who was John Maxwell's executive pastor for years. Sam Chan, Andy Stanley. Like, I've swung for the fence, my guys, and I tell leaders all the time, if you're hearing me speak and you're like, I've heard that somewhere before, I guarantee it. I've never had an original thought. Everything I know, I learned from a coach. But guess what? The number one mistake I see pastors make is isolation. Sunday's always coming, number one, the tyranny of the urgent, and pride goes before a fall. We're afraid to kind of open up and admit everything's not okay with us and with the church and all of that. But I just was willing to be vulnerable and put myself in those coaching relationships and be a sponge. It's made all the difference in our ability to just keep busting through walls, and I've never had a train wreck, and I'm better for it, because I'm in those. So I just think every leader needs a coach.
Yeah. That's amazing. Great.
Very cool.
Shawn, where can we stay connected with you at?
CourageToLead.com, at Shawn Lovejoy 1 on Facebook and Instagram.
Awesome. This has been a masterclass of leadership. So I don't know where we send our bill, but our payment for it, but we'll make sure we take care of that. But we've enjoyed having you at the table. And as we always say here at the Leadership Drip, you have a seat at the table. Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you.
Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode of the Leadership Drip. We loved having you at the table for this conversation. Would you do us a favor and comment, rate, subscribe, and share on your social media? That way we can get this content to other great leaders. And stay connected with us on Instagram at the Leadership Drip and on Twitter at Leadership Drip. And remember, you have a seat at the table.